When the shots ceased in Europe, the Allied command had more than 60 American divisions on German soil. In total, the contingent on the continent exceeded 3 million personnel. When the fighting ended, those same units became the force responsible for imposing control over the defeated nation. Thus, the military type of occupation was born, whose objective consisted of establishing absolute dominance through the direct presence of soldiers in every corner of the country. The detachments were deployed throughout the territory, even in extensive regions. An infantry division was temporarily tasked with guarding an area almost double the size of the state of Delaware. Another had to supervise more than 2,000 square miles. To fulfill that mission, the battalions operated separately, and the companies were considered the ideal structure. They could be easily housed in existing buildings and maintain constant communication without traveling great distances. It was not rare for entire platoons to work isolated, at a great distance from their headquarters. How did that military occupation end up becoming a forbidden relationship between victors and vanquished? The arrival of the victors, the beginning of the American occupation. It all began with an overwhelming presence. Soldiers took over the guarding of crossroads, bridges, and border stations. They maintained checkpoints at intersections, sent mobile patrols to detain those who violated curfews, and guarded fixed points such as displaced persons camps, prisons, telephone networks, factories, banks, and railway infrastructures. In the initial months, the number of personnel was so high that they could protect almost any location, even those without obvious strategic value. The former combat troops thus transitioned to performing internal security duties. This model of occupation clearly conveyed to the German population that they had lost the war and that their country was under foreign domination. In theory, this strategy was capable of preventing any initial attempt at rebellion, although no obvious signs of organized resistance were detected. However, this form of control required a military force far greater than what was available for a prolonged period. Furthermore, it negatively affected both operational capacity and discipline. Large units lost cohesion, while in smaller groups, conduct began to deteriorate. Paradoxically, those who should have benefited most directly, namely the authorities of the military government, concluded that it would have been preferable to have police battalions specifically created for those functions. That idea had already been rejected in previous years. The soldiers thought in terms of military protection, so their priorities usually differed from those that would have favored a more efficient administration. An officer responsible for public order in a German city explained that he had to spend a significant part of his day convincing the deployed troops that their role was not limited to watching for potential sabotage targets or checking permits. It was also necessary to guard multi-million-dollar works of art, official documents stored in large quantities, and numerous rail cars with sensitive materials, all under the direct responsibility of the military government. This difference in approach generated practical tensions. One of the most obvious drawbacks of this massive deployment was its temporary nature. Most of the uniformed personnel were destined for the Pacific theater of operations or to return home. For many, their function in Germany had concluded with the surrender. Some would remain a few weeks, others a few months. However, all were destined to be replaced or relocated in a short time. In the month of July, once the withdrawal to the assigned areas was completed, Central Command published a repositioning plan. This new scheme was based on a projection of 8 divisions as a permanent occupation force. 3 would be assigned to the Western District, 4 to the Eastern, 1 with a separate fraction in Berlin, and an additional regiment in the port city of Bremen. The army-type occupation system would be maintained, although with modifications. 2 special regiments, 1 armoured and 1 airborne, would be trained that could react quickly in case of crisis. The remainder would continue to perform static duties, although they would be established in larger groupings near administrative centres, avoiding the dispersal of units as done previously. This adjustment sought to reduce fragmentation and optimize available resources. By concentrating troops near key nodes, response capability was gained, discipline maintenance was facilitated, and logistical difficulties were limited. Thus, they intended to correct the problems detected during the initial phase, when dispersal generated a loss of control, operational wear, and frustration among the commanders. Orders of isolation, the policy of non-fraternization. The Supreme Commander's headquarters had issued, since March of 1945, a clear regulation for all deployed personnel. It was strictly forbidden to establish ties of any nature with individuals of German nationality. This instruction, drafted weeks before the official end of the conflict, reaffirmed a previous order that had already been applied in North Africa and during the American presence in French territory. Not only were friendly or close relationships prevented, but also interactions of seemingly little importance, such as casual verbal exchanges. Soldiers had to completely abstain from engaging in conversation, except in cases where it was strictly essential for functional reasons, and even then the language had to be reduced to the minimum. For the authorities in charge of administration under military control, this directive not only hampered their daily activities, but also created a contradictory scenario. Locally, those who had to implement reconstruction, supervision, or administrative coordination tasks were forced to maintain constant contact with German residents. This put the superior mandate in conflict with the demands of fieldwork. Beyond the operational aspects, this barrier imposed between victors and vanquished eroded the official discourse that sought to show Americans as agents of liberation, not as dominators. The obligatory distance contributed to maintaining the image of the absolute occupier and undermined any effort at institutional rapprochement. Various communication strategy officials within the Allied command immediately warned that the measure had counterproductive effects, both psychologically and strategically. The logic imposed from above clashed with the realities of the barracks. Among the uniformed personnel, the disposition generated confusion, discomfort, and in many cases rejection. Its compliance was insisted upon through constant reminders, internal publications directed at platoons, and specific sanctions applied as a deterrent example. However, in practice, the order was not only frequently breached, but also became a source of ridicule. For many, it seemed unfeasible to maintain such isolation in contexts where forced coexistence made exchanges, however brief, inevitable. The rules began to quickly dilute when, in June, personnel were allowed for the first time to address children. Shortly thereafter, the use of the language with adults was authorized if the purpose was to preserve security in the areas of responsibility. This partial opening marked the beginning of a progressive flexibilization. In the course of the following weeks, the initial rigidity was left in the past. By mid-July, the regulation had already lost operational validity in most of the detachments. Intermediate commanders observed that, as the units gained stability, recovered discipline, and adopted less forced routines, problematic behaviors decreased. Therefore, it was no longer necessary to apply extreme measures. The experience showed that serious episodes of indiscipline were scarce, and in certain aspects, the prohibited contacts had generated beneficial results. Reports prepared by health bodies of the War Department indicated that, far from being an immediate risk, the rapprochement between soldiers and the population could even facilitate certain controls. The initial policy of rigorous distancing had been born from a strictly defensive vision, focused on avoiding ideological contagions, emotional disturbances, or unwanted conflicts. But this prediction failed to sustain itself against the real dynamics of an extended occupation. In various reports, it was highlighted that limited contact, when managed intelligently, did not produce negative effects. On the contrary, it favored the identification of needs, allowed for the anticipation of security problems, and contributed to humanizing the environment. The coexistence imposed by the occupation map made absolute prohibition impracticable, both for logistical reasons and for basic human conditions. From the first days following the German capitulation, the contradictions between the official discourse and the day-to-day became evident. Commanders on the ground pointed out that the local population, far from showing direct hostility, often approached the troops, whether out of necessity, curiosity, or despair. This reality placed the soldiers before a dilemma: to literally obey a rule that was not very viable, or to apply their own criteria based on the situation. Many chose to interpret the order with flexibility, especially when they saw that there were no serious reprisals. This structural ambiguity weakened the effectiveness of the institutional message and fostered a climate of growing permissiveness. The chain of command tried to reiterate the validity of the policy through bulletins, written instructions, and briefing sessions. Nevertheless, these actions had a limited scope. The pressure to comply progressively reduced, and the general perception among the soldiers was that the norm had become obsolete. Meanwhile, inside the offices of the High Command, there was debate about the real utility of maintaining an order that could no longer be applied uniformly. Some sectors advocated for completely reformulating the approach, adapting it to the new objectives of stability and institutional collaboration. Others defended its validity as a symbol of authority and control. In the rural areas and distant towns, where the detachments were small and contact with the residents was constant, fraternization went practically unnoticed. Physical barriers were non-existent, and the distances between the military posts and the civilian dwellings resulted minimal. In contrast, in the large cities where the levels of vigilance were greater, compliance was more rigorous. Even so, the gaps were evident. Patrols frequently encountered scenes that reflected a normalization of the forbidden relationships. This reinforced the idea that the official policy was losing its reason for being. Internal reports began to reflect this transition. Fewer incidents related to excesses or conflicts derived from the contact between troops and civilians were documented. Furthermore, it was highlighted that informal exchanges contributed, in many cases, to reducing tensions. For this reason, some officers began to consider that the progressive lifting of the regulation could be beneficial. This stance gained strength, especially among those with direct experience in the field. The distance between strategic planning and real implementation had never been so evident. The evolution of the no-fraternization policy became, unintentionally, a reflection of the internal tensions of the occupation. On one hand, the desire to maintain unquestionable authority. On the other, the need to adapt to the realities of a defeated but still present population. The measure, conceived as an instrument of symbolic control, ended up being blurred in the face of daily practice. The occupation could not be maintained under parameters of prolonged warfare. The troops required another kind of instruction, more adapted to the post-war environment than to the conflict already concluded. In parallel, criticisms from American civilian sectors increased, questioning the absolute isolation as an official stance. They argued that, if the purpose was to democratize and re-educate, contact was inevitable. Some voices pointed out that rapprochement could be a useful tool to detect hostile attitudes, identify ideological remnants, and generate an environment less prone to radicalization. These opinions, although not the majority, began to gain ground in internal debates. Internally, intermediate commanders reported that emotional wear and tear was more evident in the units, where the prohibition was applied with greater severity. Forced isolation generated frustration, increased internal tension, and reduced cohesion among the members. In contrast, where interaction occurred in a controlled manner, conflict rates decreased. This data helped reinforce the argument that the regulation had to be rethought. Direct experience became the basis for a deep review of the original approach. The strategic context also influenced. With the Pacific Front still active, and the need to maintain high morale among the soldiers, the authorities understood that imposing excessively restrictive measures could have negative consequences. The occupation was no longer a temporary mission. It was shaping up to be a complex, prolonged process with multiple facets. In that context, absolute isolation proved not only impractical, but counterproductive. The order that once intended to draw an impassable line between two worlds ended up, in practice, dissolving under its own weight. The American soldiers, although still subject to formal instructions, began to move with greater freedom. The rules were relaxed without the need for new official provisions. The change was silent, but firm. Priorities evolved, and with them, the application of the rules. El Last Command, the internal war for the control of Germany. When the High Commands met in June of 1945, Clay explained to them that the authorities in Washington considered that the administration of Germany did not correspond to soldiers. The objective was to hand over that control to civilian hands as soon as circumstances permitted. Truman, weeks before, had expressed that the uniformed personnel should be limited to strictly military functions and that the political direction of the defeated country should soon pass to other bodies. That idea was shared by Eisenhower, who met with the president in Frankfurt towards the end of July. Both concluded that the military command should prepare a structure suitable for the immediate transfer to civil authorities. From the beginning, the American Control Council had been conceived as a transitional body, aimed at facilitating the administrative relief. Already in April, Clay had proposed incorporating civilians into the military government team so that they could assume the direction as soon as the transfer was realized. 1 month later, he reiterated that the organism should rapidly transform into a civilian entity with the capacity to manage Germany under non-military criteria. In a meeting at the end of June, he commented that he was already introducing non-uniformed specialists into the key sections of the command, and that, according to his understanding, his function was precisely that, to coordinate the transition towards a non-military scheme. While the war in the Pacific was still active, the number of uniformed personnel was so high that it was not seen as necessary to reduce the military presence in the occupation offices. Even in the Control Council, the civilian personnel grew modestly in comparison with the increases in military personnel. In May there were 83 civilians, and in September 326, but the officers and soldiers in that same body went from 117 to almost 1,500, and the rank-and-file soldiers from little more than 500 to more than 4,000. In the 2 following months, however, the situation changed. The troops began to be displaced outside of Germany, and the civilians increased until reaching 429. In the first week of September, Clay launched a plan for several officers to agree to continue their functions, but under civilian status. On the 1 of October, he ordered a review of all the posts of the military government, with the aim of assigning them to non-armed personnel. Eisenhower, for his part, asked the commands not to interfere in that process. The internal dispute between the G5 section of the Theatre of Operations and the Control Council ended that same month, with Clay imposing his judgment. He and Adcock, the general in charge of G5, decided to unify their teams, assigning each administrative division to Frankfurt or Berlin, depending on where it could operate better. Adcock effectively assumed the role of his second-in-command. Days later, Clay expressed his intention to merge both structures into a single general office in charge of the occupation government. That merger implied disconnecting the military chain of command from the functions of territorial administration, which generated resistance in various intermediate commands. The G5 sections of the military divisions, which had no differentiated functions, were the most affected. In September, Clay had to decide between 2 plans. One immediately eliminated the G5 units and placed everything under the Control Council. The other implied the same fate, but gradually. Clay chose this second approach. Starting from the 1st of October, the Control Council was renamed the Office of the United States Military Government. The theater's G5 was renamed the Office of Military Government for the American Zone. The regional offices also changed. That of the Third Army was integrated with that of Bavaria, and that of the Seventh Army was transformed into that of the Western District. For the troops in the field, this reorganization meant the end of the model in which tactical forces also carried out local administration. Later, clear orders were issued. Government functions by the Army had to cease completely starting from the 31st of December. From then on, the new administrative apparatus began its practical transition towards Berlin. Clay had to balance the symbolism of locating the headquarters in the capital with the efficiency offered by Frankfurt, which was much better equipped and had an already consolidated functional network. The move was designed in stages, striving not to paralyze daily work or weaken coordination between the commands. The transfer also marked the beginning of a clearer separation between military and civilian tasks within the American zone. The day after officially approving the new administrative structure, Clay wrote to McCloy explaining that the final intention was to completely separate the government apparatus from the military forces. His vision was that this separation should be carried out with urgency. Eisenhower, for his part, communicated to the commanders that the army should be prepared to detach itself from those functions with barely 24 hours' notice. Clay did not expect such a dizzying pace. Upon reading the first draft of the report that Price was going to deliver to the President, where the handover of control to a civil commissioner designated by Washington was proposed, he responded that such a decision could not be unilateral. The other 3 occupying powers had to agree, and he anticipated that the entire process would take at least until July of the following year. In private, several army leaders expressed their desire to leave that task as soon as possible. Smith, one of Eisenhower's principal advisers, acknowledged to Price that he was not convinced that civilians could handle the situation better, but that from an internal perspective it was preferable to withdraw as quickly as possible. The atmosphere was increasingly hostile, and continuing in that function could affect the image of the armed forces. At the end of October in Washington, the Secretaries of War, Navy and State met to discuss the matter. Patterson opined that the State Department should assume control. Burns, head of Foreign Affairs, considered that the army had better organization and that it was a mistake to rush the change. If his department finally had to assume command, he suggested postponing that announcement for at least 8 more months. 3 days later, Eisenhower wrote to Truman recalling their joint commitment from July and suggesting that the complete transition should take place by June of 1946 at the latest. The president accepted that date and communicated it to the press, officially establishing that the transfer of the military government to civilian hands would take place before the 1st of June of the following year. The Winter of Chaos, when women paid for the defeat. As the year 1945 progressed, the authorities managing the control of Germany sensed a catastrophic winter. From the first signs of uncultivated fields, inactive mines and destroyed cities, the Allied decision-makers feared a scenario of chaos. As early as June, reports warned of a crisis that could require armed repression. In August, Eisenhower alerted the German leaders about what was coming. By October, the High Command considered a wave of riots probable, so they ordered local leaders to be warned that they would be responsible for any aggression against the occupying forces. Initially, the population seemed too stunned to react. As the summer passed and basic conditions worsened, the collective mood plummeted. Without enough coal or food, and with producers reluctant to sell for worthless money, civilians began to sink into a spiral of anguish. Although the harvest was not bad, it was not enough to cover the needs of the winter. The transport of coal barely functioned, and deliveries to the American sector were drastically reduced as the year went on. In response, the authorities requisitioned any reserve exceeding 250 kilograms and demanded that children bring firewood to the schools so they could be heated. The devaluation of the currency combined with the issuance of Allied banknotes caused fear of hyperinflation. The population, unable to buy almost anything, opted to invest in postage stamps. Many workers only attended work just enough to keep their ration cards. The situation worsened when it was announced that more than 2 million Germans expelled from the East would be resettled between December and July. The distribution included hundreds of thousands from Czechoslovakia and Hungary to the area controlled by the United States. The news of an agreement to exchange displaced persons between occupied zones did not calm anyone. No one expected the newcomers to return to their places of origin. Housing and feeding these people was the exclusive responsibility of the Germans, and neither the authorities nor the population were prepared. A general from the Third Army went so far as to declare that there would not be room even by piling the newcomers one on top of the other. Simultaneously, the possibility of releasing thousands of prisoners of war in the following months was being considered. The plans included returning tens of thousands from the United States and possibly repatriating more than 500,000 from France due to the critical state they were in. Eisenhower halted the transfers to French soil upon ascertaining that many were on the verge of death. In turn, maintaining prisoners was more expensive than hiring civilian workers, so it was planned to offload that burden onto Germany. By October, Clay already knew that he would not manage to increase the caloric level to 2,000 per day. They barely reached 1,250, insufficient to survive without heating. In November, an increase to 1,500 daily calories was announced, although with doubts about its feasibility. That ration was equivalent in practical terms to bread, potatoes, some oatmeal, a teaspoon of fat, and another of sugar. Proteins were a rare luxury, as were vegetables. To alleviate the situation, community kitchens were created throughout the country. In Bavaria, millions of monthly rations were served, although one had to hand over coupons and even pay for the food if one was not in an emergency situation. In December, the sending of aid from private American organizations was finally authorized under the condition of fair distribution. Despite everything, Christmas was not as desolate as feared. A goose cost thousands of marks, and the black market offered old army cans recycled as if they were stews. The ruined streets offered few toys, barely some pencils and ornaments. In Stuttgart, a tree with lights at the headquarters of a newspaper brutally contrasted with the prevailing darkness. However, the unusually warm weather helped. Many remembered that the previous year had ended with a rain of bombs. The American soldiers organized celebrations for the children. In Wetzlar, for example, they distributed sweets to thousands of school children. In other cities, they also distributed toys and treats. Some authorities cynically noted that the only Germans who approached to offer holiday greetings were former members of the Nazi Party seeking to ingratiate themselves. Right after Christmas, a windstorm ravaged poorly repaired roofs and walls, leaving streets full of debris. Despite this, the good weather persisted until January, which avoided a major tragedy. Thanks to the ration maintained at 1,550 calories, the mood began to improve. Although food supplies were running out, many believed that the situation was stabilizing. The displaced persons and the interned Nazis received many more calories than the rest. The former reached 2,600 a day, the latter 2,200. In contrast, the general population barely reached 1,900, including the black market. In Berlin, the infant mortality rate dropped noticeably, especially compared to the previous summer. However, everything depended on imports that were running out. By March, there were supplies left for less than 2 months. Meanwhile, the army faced another kind of crisis. Shortly before leaving command, Eisenhower publicly reprimanded his troops for their behavior. He mentioned problems with the uniform, aggressive conduct, and lack of respect both towards civilians and among soldiers. Even though he insisted that it was a minority, investigations indicated the opposite. In October, the Stuttgart police registered more than a dozen assaults in a single week. In another town, several drunken soldiers beat local officials, broke windows, tried to stab civilians, and stole belongings. In Bavaria, a young woman died in a supposed hunting accident. In another area, police officers reported having been shot at by soldiers on more than one occasion. Almost all incidents were related to alcohol and women. The release of penicillin for treating venereal diseases indirectly encouraged prostitution, which further escalated conflicts. By December, assaults against police and authorities were so frequent that special communiques were issued asking for restraint from the troops. The abuses were not limited to the lower ranks. The case of an officer who raped an Austrian woman and then handed her over to the police with false charges was documented. Part of the problem resided in the combination of veterans on the verge of being discharged, who sought to vent before leaving, and new recruits without adequate experience or training. Furthermore, messages from the High Command hardening the attitude towards the Germans could be misinterpreted as permission to act without restraint, especially under the effects of alcohol. On the other hand, the displaced persons continued to be a bad example. They acted without restrictions, and the soldiers saw constant impunity. By the end of the year, another focus of tension was emerging: the drastic reduction in the transfers of soldiers returning to the United States. After months of massive repatriation, it was announced that the pace would drop sharply in January. Thousands of soldiers, with sufficient merit to be discharged, felt betrayed. The news that war brides would be sent before them unleashed anger. In Paris and Frankfurt, there were massive protests. Although they were not violent, they reflected an internal decomposition of the military body. These protests had an effect. By mid-January, a new plan was approved so that all soldiers with a certain number of points would return before April. Simultaneously, the number of occupation troops was reduced, but the replacements arriving not only lacked technical preparation, but many had not even received basic training beyond the use of the rifle or hygiene standards. In March, an inspection revealed serious failures in discipline, organization, command and control. Many young officers and non-commissioned officers lacked the skills to manage their units. In parallel, the military authorities and the police pointed to the American troops themselves as the main source of riots. In April, with more than 100 incidents registered in just 4 days, an order was given to report every case directly to the Commander-in-Chief. The units involved and the sanctions applied had to be indicated. The disorder was widespread, and the occupation was on the verge of operational collapse. The children of silence, pregnancies, abandonment and shame. From the end of 1945, a singular image became established among the American soldiers. When walking through the ruined streets, it was not the German men or the remnants of the fallen regime that stood out, but the female figures. Women appeared as public figures of a vanquished nation. This perception was reinforced by reports, caricatures and surveys that placed the Fräulein as the center of attention for the troops, largely ignoring the German men. That representation directly affected how the soldiers interpreted their presence there. Contact with women became frequent and visible. These were encounters that were not seen as part of the official policy, but as private expressions that escaped the declared objectives of the occupation. In this new scenario, many German women began to connect with the army from different fronts, both in formal and informal settings, seeking some kind of relief from the social collapse. Some women, as secretaries or translators, gained access to additional rations and salaries that improved their conditions. This allowed them to feed their families and survive without necessarily depending on a romantic relationship. However, the majority of young women did not have access to stable jobs and saw the soldiers as a means of subsistence. Many established exchanges: food, soap, cigarettes in return for laundry, domestic favors, or in many cases, relationships. The line separating affectionate relationships from prostitution became blurred. Even those who defended the purity of their bond with a soldier accused others of acting out of interest. For many, the body became currency. Some were sent by their own families, who needed food or coal. The informal barter system became part of daily life. A German wristwatch could be exchanged for butter, canned meat, or cigarettes. This hidden circuit was sustained thanks to the exclusive access that Americans had to scarce goods. The authorities could do little. The effects began to become visible in the hospitals. In 1946, 16% of births were out of wedlock, and 1/6 were children of soldiers. The figure was around 94,000 during the entire occupation. Some spoke ironically of sending only uniforms instead of troops if there were another war. Women had no legal way to demand support from the father. Military rules made it clear that no acknowledgement of paternity was required unless the soldier accepted it voluntarily. German civil courts were also not an option. Soldiers were prohibited from appearing there, and military courts did not process civil cases. Thus, even those who wanted to assume custody of their children faced obstacles. They could neither adopt them nor assume formal responsibilities. The same logic applied to marriage. Despite the official end of the fraternization prohibition in 1945, marrying German women was not authorized until December of 1946. Even then, the procedures were complex: medical tests, character investigations, interviews with chaplains, special permits. Some soldiers waited months. Others, like Russell Horton, decided to marry without authorization. Some wrote to President Truman or to generals of the European theater asking for exceptions. Many returned to the United States without having been able to marry and later appealed from there. Although Congress approved laws to allow the entry of foreign wives and fiancées, obstacles remained. The German women were required to have exit permits, moral review, and a social examination. Many did not manage to complete the process in time. Over time, the number of authorized marriages grew. By June of 1950, more than 14,000 German wives had entered the United States with their soldier husbands. There were even more of British origin, but the German figures widely surpassed those of other nations. Within these couples, the women represented not only an effective bond, but also a symbolic function. The occupying soldier, by connecting with a local woman, transitioned from being a punitive agent to a protective figure. Reconstruction also passed through the bedroom, the plate of food, and the shared room. However, the most invisible issue was that of the African American children born in Germany. The figures ranged between 2,000 and 3,000. These children suffered particular rejection. The mothers were often marginalized, called with insults like Negro lover, or excluded from local commerce. Some children were threatened, discriminated against, or removed from schools. In surveys from 1949, however, it was observed that German mothers were more likely to raise their mixed-race children than women in Japan or England. But that did not mean social acceptance. Many hoped to go to the United States, believing that there would be less racism there. The military authorities systematically blocked marriage applications between African American soldiers and German women. Permits were denied more often than in the cases of white soldiers. Many engagements never materialized. Despite the difficulties, hundreds of couples formed. Some even moved in together, leading domestic lives, although without legal validation. Meanwhile, the image of the occupied woman was consolidating in the press, in films, and in popular culture. Some officials viewed this trend as a threat to the moral order. The figure of the German woman turned into a sex symbol occupied the center of the debate. It was feared that they were seducing naive soldiers. In the United States, reports and films were published warning about the risks of these relationships. The perception that the women were Nazifying the GIs became common. It was assumed that the soldiers did not understand what those relationships represented. Others blamed the officers for not better explaining the motives of the conflict. In late 46 and early 47, the wives of officers were sent to Germany to curb relationships with German women. The regulations began to slowly relax. The bureaucracy was still dense, but increasingly more soldiers managed to get married or take their wives to the United States. 2 years after the end of the war, the soldiers saw the German women less as part of a defeated enemy and more as partners in the reconstruction. Fraternization, far from disappearing, became institutionalized, even with public policies like the care packages and the aid letters that connected soldiers with German families. What began as scattered sexual contacts ended up completely transforming the relationship between occupiers and occupied. The German woman went from a symbol of defeat to a figure of the new beginning. Forbidden love, marriages between soldiers and German women. At the end of the war, contact between American soldiers and the German civilian population could no longer be stopped. What began as an exchange of cautious glances transformed over the course of the months into closer and more complicated bonds. At the beginning of 1946, reports from the United States military government recognized that personal relationships had spread throughout Germany. The commanders observed with bewilderment how their own men, who previously despised the defeated enemy, now shared tables, walks, and rooms with German women. The interaction ceased to be clandestine. Some women were still motivated by material need, others by a genuine desire to escape the emotional void left by the war. In both cases, the American soldiers became figures of power, protectors, lovers, or even saviors in the midst of the chaos. In this new scenario, personal bonds began to take on a deeper meaning: affection, gratitude, or the search for stability. The army observed this phenomenon with ambivalence. On one hand, the authorities wanted to encourage the re-education of the German people, to rebuild their morale and shape their values. On the other hand, the very soldiers who were supposed to teach discipline and democracy began to fall in love, marry, or form homes with the women who until recently represented the enemy. The military occupation thus transformed into a social process where politics mixed with the intimate. Contact between victors and the vanquished became commonplace, and with it appeared dilemmas that the military structure had not foreseen: pregnancies, engagements, improvised marriages, and the slow acceptance that civilian life was returning, although in new and unequal forms. Between 1946 and 1947, romantic relationships became a recurring theme in internal reports. Officials spoke of controlled fraternization, a euphemism to refer to a reality they could no longer hide. In the destroyed cities, soldiers and young German women shared dances, meals, and celebrations. The physical closeness also became emotional. Many of those men, who had spent months of war without emotional bonds, found a sense of normalcy in these women. For the women, the bond offered protection, food, or even the possibility of leaving the country. The result was a convergence of interests that, although unequal, created thousands of personal stories in the midst of the reconstruction. The American command attempted to integrate this phenomenon into its policy of democratic re-education. The authorities saw the relationship between their soldiers and the civilian population as a means to soften the image of the occupier and foster trust. But the boundary between the sentimental and the institutional proved diffuse. The closeness led to marriages, some legal, others de facto, which faced bureaucratic obstacles. The army did not have a clear protocol for unions between their men and the women of a recently defeated nation. In the first years, only a small percentage managed to formalize their union. It is estimated that barely 2% of the soldiers who maintained stable relationships with German women managed to marry legally. The rest lived in a grey area, where love and convenience mixed with uncertainty and disapproval. American families, upon learning of these bonds, showed rejection. For many parents, a son married to a German woman was a reminder of a recent and bloody war. Letters appeared in local newspapers denouncing this dishonor, while civil authorities feared that these unions would damage the country's image. In Germany, on the other hand, the phenomenon was viewed with a mixture of hope and resentment. Some young women dreamed of a new life in the United States. Others suffered the contempt of their neighbors, who considered them traitors. Public morals were in crisis, and the love between a foreign soldier and a German woman became a symbol of that transformation. In the records of the military government appear hundreds of marriage applications. Each one had to go through a long review process where background, morality, and motivations were evaluated. The paperwork piled up in the occupation offices while the soldiers awaited permits that often never arrived. Many unions were frustrated by distance or troop rotation. Others continued in secret, with promises made in borrowed rooms or letters crossing the Atlantic. The civil authorities in the United States eventually created a specific procedure to allow certain German wives to emigrate under the condition of being evaluated as morally fit. That ambiguous and discriminatory category determined the fate of thousands of women. The approval process was not simple. Candidates had to present health certificates, residence documents, and proof that they had had no ties to the Nazi Party. In some cases, they were questioned about their education, religion, or reputation. The files included observations from the commanders, who assessed whether the Union benefited or harmed the army. Love became subordinate to military bureaucracy. Many soldiers returned home alone to their country, leaving behind women who, in addition to poverty, faced the stigma of having loved the enemy. In letters addressed to the authorities, some asked for help to reunite with their husbands or claim unfulfilled promises. Few received a response. Meanwhile, the most lasting bonds began to have symbolic weight. In cities like Berlin, Frankfurt, or Munich, mixed marriages became small social laboratories. The couples were observed with curiosity. A soldier in an impeccable uniform, walking arm in arm with a German woman still dressed in mended clothes. In these scenes, cultural difference and the illusion of a common future mixed. The children born from these unions, sometimes called children of the occupation, represented the first post-war generation. Some were raised in Germany, others traveled to the United States with their mothers. All carried an ambiguous identity that reflected the complexity of the historical moment. In the meantime, army commands tried to publicly justify this process. Reports from 1946 and 1947 spoke of effective democratization, a way to soften the image of the occupier. The re-education policy extended to private life, transforming personal relationships into a field of political action. Recreation, sports, and assistance programs for German youth served to control and channel contacts between both populations. In these spaces, emotions mixed with the pedagogical discourse. Many soldiers acted as mentors, instructors, or father figures, while others maintained discreet romantic ties. What the army had tried to avoid, intimacy with the enemy, ended up becoming an involuntary tool for integration. The military government statistics showed a progressive increase in marriages and cohabitation requests. The authorities began to view the reality with more pragmatism. If coexistence was inevitable, it should at least be regulated. In the youth clubs and cultural centers administered by the army, social interaction between soldiers and Germans became more visible. Dances, gatherings, and parties were organized with the intention of channeling this contact into an acceptable framework. In parallel, sincere relationships also emerged. Amidst rationing, curfews, and lack of housing, some managed to build an improvised home. The images of American soldiers walking hand-in-hand with German women ceased to cause scandal and began to be seen as a sign of normalization. The cases of legal marriage, though a minority, opened the way for a new phase of the occupation. German wives who managed to emigrate to the United States were presented by the press as examples of reconciliation. However, many faced rejection and isolation in their new communities. Consular reports mentioned that numerous women suffered discrimination, suspicion, or loneliness. Some were abandoned shortly after arriving, others adapted with effort, learning the language and raising children in an environment that barely understood them. The story of each of these women was marked by the crossing between war and love. As these stories multiplied and became more visible, illusions also began to fade. The contrast between love and abandonment, promise and disappointment, marked the close of that stage. In 1947, authorities calculated that only 2 out of every 100 American soldiers who had maintained stable ties with German women managed to formalize their union. The rest were lost between oblivion and distance. The stories of those women remained scattered in reports, letters, or archived files. Some continued to write to the barracks seeking a response. Others resigned themselves to raising alone the children of a war that no one wanted to remember anymore. With the passing of the years, contact between both societies changed form. The soldiers were no longer just occupiers. Many became husbands, fathers, or resident citizens. The line between victor and vanquished blurred. In the cultural and educational exchange programs promoted by the American administration, cooperation replaced distrust. However, the imprint of those first intimate encounters remained. The relationships between soldiers and German women were at once a reflection of post-war misery and a prelude to reconciliation. Towards 1949, when the troops began to withdraw and the military administration gave way to the new German government, many of those couples had already disappeared. What remained, however, were the children, the photographs, and the scattered memories. The final occupation reports indicated that the coexistence between Americans and Germans had been one of the most influential factors in the social reconstruction of the country. Behind the figures and statistics were the lives of those who crossed the borders of hatred to form, even briefly, an improbable family. The last lines of those documents acknowledged what had been denied for years. That contact between the soldiers and the German women had been as decisive as any economic or political measure, not only because of the marriages, but because it revealed a deeper transformation. Amidst rationing and destruction, love, in all its forms, had survived. Although only a small number of unions managed to be formalized, their existence was enough to demonstrate that, even after a total war, it was possible to look at the enemy again without hatred. The New Germany: Re-education, Morale and Cultural Control. After the German defeat, one of the principles established by the JCS 1067 directive was the gradual preparation for reconstructing German political life under a democratic system. However, that same instruction ordered not to allow any type of political activity without the express authorization of the military command, emphasizing that the American administration should not align itself with any political current or group. The FM 27-5 manual, published 2 years earlier, stressed that neither local political leaders nor organized parties should influence the policies of the military government. Therefore, the Schaeff approach from the beginning was not to encourage the return of politics, but rather to prevent its reappearance. After the surrender, this prohibition worked almost completely. For 12 years, the Nazi regime had eliminated any political structure that was not its own. Communists and Social Democrats had been imprisoned or forced into exile, while other groups were neutralized or absorbed through pressure or violence. The German population, not very fond of partisan politics, remembered the fate of the Marxist and bourgeois formations under Hitler, as well as the current situation of the Nazis under occupation. When Schaeff G2 examined the German political landscape in July of 1945, it concluded that no real political activity existed, but merely scattered conversations among some survivors of the old parties. On the ground, however, the military authorities began to notice that the political sphere went beyond the parties. The designated German representatives often reflected social, religious, or economic positions, many times with a political background, even if they did not have formal affiliation. According to a G5 survey, in the absence of a defined political program, it was particular interests, such as those of the church or certain influential individuals, that set the course. The risk was that the occupation authorities would end up being responsible for the consequences derived from decisions made by people who, in theory, were apolitical. In June, General Clay faced a complicated situation with the appointment of the First Minister-President of Bavaria, Fritz Schäfer, which led him to recommend to McCloy a flexibility in the veto of political activity. With the support of the Potsdam Agreements, it was decided to allow and encourage the creation of democratic parties. One day, after announcing to the Germans that they could participate in local political activities, Eisenhower ordered the military districts to begin granting licenses at the local level, but the response was minimal. In most regions, only some former communists and social democrats asked vague questions about the procedure, which was not even defined yet. In Munich, a group tried to promote a cultural formation of a political nature, but the majority of the population was more concerned with hunger, housing, and daily problems. Many saw the offer as a sign of approval from the Americans, but they had no interest in getting involved in politics again, which they blamed for the national tragedy. In Kuressen, for example, the authorities detected that the majority of farmers belonged to this disinterested group, while only urban workers seemed to have any expectation regarding trade unions and parties. This widespread apathy saved the military authorities the embarrassment of still not having a system for granting licenses. Since neither USFET nor the military districts had developed concrete procedures, The program had to be frozen for 2 months. Even so, a basic political landscape began to emerge. In the Soviet zone, the model was already underway. Since June, the creation of anti-fascist parties was authorized, and in a few weeks the Communist, the Social Democrat, the Christian Democratic Union, and the Liberal Party were registered. Although all had roots prior to 1933, only the Communist one fully identified with the Soviet zone. The others were just beginning to reorganize. In the American zone, the first to appear were the Communists and the Social Democrats, benefiting from not being linked to the Nazi past. The Social Democrats could highlight that they were the only ones who voted against the dictatorial powers for Hitler in 1933. Although the Communists did not show respect for democracy during the Weimar Republic, they were brutally persecuted by the Nazis, and by being supported by a victorious power, they automatically acquired a democratic seal. Both parties, however, faced serious challenges. The Catholic Church was hostile to them, and they did not have a working-class majority. Among the pre-Nazi middle-class parties, the ones showing signs of life were the Zentrum and its Bavarian version. Their historical ties to the Catholic Church allowed them to distance themselves from Nazism, although not all their members achieved it. The military authorities, despite certain reservations, appointed several of their possible leaders, such as Adenauer in Cologne or Schaefer in Bavaria. Even so, these parties were reluctant to revive their confessional profile. Their leaders wanted to expand the electoral base and feared not being able to compete with the Communists or Social Democrats. That is why they preferred the political prohibition to be prolonged. But when those parties began to organize, they found themselves pushed to promote broader Christian parties. The concept of an interdenominational Christian party, opposed to atheist Marxism, was formalized in March of 1945 in Cologne. In the Soviet zone, it was baptized as the Christian Democratic Union, CDU, on the 25th of June. In the American zone, the name Christian Social People's Party was first used, but in September, CDU was adopted in the West and CSU in Bavaria. These new parties attempted to bring together all sectors opposed to communism and socialism. The right wing appealed to entrepreneurs, large landowners, and bourgeoisie. The left wing sought the support of small traders, farmers, and public employees. Even in working-class areas, they accepted nationalization proposals. The CSU, furthermore, presented itself as the defender of Bavarian identity and Catholic values. Both groups showed their willingness to accept repentant former Nazis and argued that the purge should be limited to the Nazi elite, excluding those called Nazis by obligation. The Liberal Party, resurrected in the Soviet zone under the name of the Liberal Democratic Party, represented a modern version of the old German Democratic Party. In the American zone, variants such as the People's Democratic Party emerged. This group defended private property, the free market and secularism, which brought them closer to the American model. However, their social base was limited, and their intermediate position was overshadowed by the extensive programs of the CDU-CSU and the Social Democrats. Their most solid presence was in Württemberg-Baden, where one of its founders, Reinhold Meier, was appointed by the occupation authorities as minister-president. American analysts expressed concern about the scarcity of capable figures in all parties. Many leaders had died, gone into exile, or were elderly. Those who survived Nazism were not, for the most part, prominent figures, but rather irrelevant individuals who never aroused suspicion. The appearance of Josef Müller, founder of the CSU, surprised the Americans. A respected lawyer and member of a Munich aristocratic family, he had ties to the Catholic Church and a past in the military intelligence service, although he spent the last months of the war in a concentration camp. His contacts with the Americans were good, but it was also suspected that he had connections with the Soviets. While defending the inclusion of minor Nazis, he claimed to have been an intermediary with the Vatican during the resistance. Facing his main rival, Schaefer, some began to see him as a valid option within the democratic game. General Clay decided to speed up the process. He considered that the best way to learn democracy was by applying it, and the reduction of troops after the end of the war in the Pacific offered him a practical excuse. In September, he proposed holding local elections in January of 1946 in municipalities with fewer than 20,000 inhabitants and extending them to larger regions in the following months. The decision was so sudden that they were announced before the regulations for licensing parties were ready. These instructions did not reach the local offices until October. The measure was poorly received by almost everyone. Both Americans and Germans thought that the elections were premature. A re-education program did not exist, and holding elections barely 8 months after the end of the war seemed reckless. Furthermore, in October, only 6 districts in Bavaria had approved local parties. In some places, no one showed up to form parties. The rules required that each application have 25 sponsors with individual forms, which exposed them to intelligence reviews. Even the already legalized parties themselves preferred to delay the voting for fear of failing or losing their positions, since many of their members were officials appointed by the military government. Despite the widespread resistance, Clay ordered in November that firm dates be set for the communal elections and that the registration of parties at the regional level be allowed. With this, a new political stage was opened, although a large part of the population and the authorities themselves were still not ready. After the electoral announcement, local administrations began to receive precise orders. Each authority had to prepare lists, forms, censuses, and minimal structures that would allow the elections to be carried out. In rural areas, where archives had been destroyed or abandoned, the process became chaotic. Many officials did not know how to verify identities or establish a reliable registry. Some resorted to neighbor testimonies or church records, while others improvised emergency censuses. The priority was to meet the imposed dates, even if the minimum conditions were not guaranteed. In parallel, the intelligence offices increased surveillance over the new parties. An order was given to verify the backgrounds of all signatories, identify ties to the former regime, and create profiles for every candidate. Counterintelligence teams tracked down dubious connections, but also saturated the system with unfounded suspicions. In many towns, the few volunteers interested in forming parties were subjected to such intense scrutiny that they ended up withdrawing for fear of reprisals. The result was that in several districts, the elections were held without real competition or with sole candidates. In Bavaria, where the process was more advanced, conflicts began to emerge between the groups. The CSU tried to establish itself as the dominant party in rural areas, while in industrial centers, the Social Democrats were regaining ground. The Communists, despite their organization, suffered open rejection from religious sectors. In cities like Nuremberg, tensions were reported between KPD sympathizing workers and officials appointed by the military government, who tried to curb their advance. The forced coexistence between such diverse actors generated a fragile political environment, marked by distrust. In Württemberg, the Liberals achieved some stability thanks to the support of local figures and their moderate discourse. Nevertheless, the lack of a solid national structure limited their impact. The newly founded parties depended heavily on the direct support of the occupation authorities, who discreetly intervened to prevent the communists from dominating key areas. This indirect influence generated internal tensions, as the American officers themselves debated the degree of participation they should have in the German political process. In parallel with the political rebirth, a cultural strategy with re-educational purposes was launched. The Allied authorities considered it essential to transform the collective mentality to prevent the resurgence of totalitarianism. To this end, programs for press control, school supervision, and regulation of artistic content were designed. The circulation of books with National Socialist ideology was prohibited, and filters were established to approve new publications. Publishers had to submit their manuscripts to an ideological review process before obtaining permission to print. The radio was one of the most monitored instruments. In the American zones, supervisory councils were installed that controlled the transmitted content. Only programs with democratic values were permitted, and educational broadcasts were prioritized. In some regions, the production of reports about the crimes of the previous regime was encouraged, with the aim of showing collective responsibility. These stories were broadcast during prime time and often accompanied by real testimonies, images of concentration camps, or documented figures. The intention was to generate historical awareness, although in some cases they provoked rejection or apathy. In the schools, the plan was even more ambitious. Curricular content was purged, and new teachers were trained under strict conditions. Those who had been members of the Nazi Party were excluded, unless they demonstrated having acted out of obligation and without ideological fervor. Provisional manuals were drawn up that eliminated all reference to militarism, pan-Germanism, and authoritarian leadership. In their place, basic notions of civics, pluralism, and coexistence were introduced. History courses were reformulated to include the errors of the recent past, although this task faced resistance from students and parents. The universities were also intervened. Provisional deans were appointed, often foreigners, who supervised admissions and the teaching staff. The resignation of professors compromised with the previous regime was demanded, and the return of exiled academics was encouraged. Some returned from Switzerland, France, or the United States, but others refused, arguing that Germany still did not offer minimal guarantees. The study centers were forced to open their doors under strict surveillance, with limited courses and minimal budgets. On the religious level, the authorities sought a tactical alliance with the churches. Both Catholics and Protestants were seen as possible allies to promote democratic values. The publication of parish bulletins was authorized, provided they avoided political speeches or nationalist claims. In some dioceses, the organization of youth groups for educational purposes was permitted, although these were monitored by intelligence agents. Interdenominational collaboration was encouraged, especially in areas where religious polarization had been a source of conflict in the past. In the artistic field, the situation was contradictory. On one hand, works linked to National Socialism or military exaltation were prohibited. On the other hand, the creation of new cultural expressions that reflected freedom and pluralism was encouraged. Some theaters were reopened under Allied direction, and controlled festivals were organized to showcase Germany's cultural rebirth. However, censorship was still present, and many artists opted for self-restraint. Galleries limited their exhibitions to inoffensive themes, and writers avoided all controversial content. In the print media, new publications emerged with Allied licenses. Priority was given to the appearance of regional newspapers in the hands of journalists who did not have Nazi backgrounds. These newspapers had to adopt a neutral editorial line without partisan inclinations. Opinion pieces were reviewed before publication, and the directors maintained permanent contact with American officers. Some of these publications managed to consolidate themselves as spaces for moderate debate, although others disappeared due to lack of funding or public interest. Collectively, cultural re-education was conceived as an integral process, but its real impact was uneven. While visible changes were observed in large cities, adherence to conservative values persisted in rural areas. Many inhabitants viewed the reforms as external impositions and not as a genuine transformation. Despite the institutional deployment, the results were difficult to measure. Most of the reports sent to Washington spoke of slow progress and passive resistance, rather than citizen enthusiasm. For the American authorities, however, the important thing was to lay the foundations. It was about installing a new moral structure, even if it was not immediately accepted. The priority was to prevent the return of authoritarian forms, and for that it was necessary to create institutions, media, and spaces where democracy was promoted, even if artificially at first. The bet was long-term, to build an open society from above, even at the cost of temporary rejections or setbacks. With these measures, the first cycle of German cultural and political reconstruction closed. The occupation moved toward a new phase, where the military government's direct intervention would give way to more subtle forms of influence. But the goal remained intact, to prevent the past from returning and to ensure that the future was marked by pluralism, moderation, and institutional control.